For centuries we believed the ancient world was primitive, that they moved massive stones through brute force alone. Thousands of workers, simple tools, rope and determination. That was the story we told ourselves. That was the explanation that made sense within the boundaries of what we understood. But what if we were wrong? What if the greatest civilizations on Earth possessed a technology so advanced that we're only now beginning to understand it? A technology that didn't require steel or electricity or modern machinery. A technology that used something far more fundamental, something that existed before civilization itself. Sound. A frequency, a vibration, a power that moves through the very foundation of matter itself. And the evidence isn't hidden in lost temples or forgotten libraries. It's standing right in front of us, in the stones themselves, carved into their surfaces, embedded in their dimensions, resonating within their structure. Listen to what these megalithic structures are trying to tell us. Because standing in front of Puma Punku in Bolivia, a structure so precisely built that modern engineers still cannot replicate it, you begin to understand something fundamental. This wasn't built by strength. This was built by understanding. An understanding of frequency, of vibration, of the way sound can reshape stone at the molecular level, of the way the human voice, amplified and directed through specific geometric patterns, can move thousands of tons of rock with precision that defies explanation. A scientist who spent 40 years studying acoustic engineering stood beneath the walls of Baalbek and whispered something that would reshape how we understand ancient technology. They knew something we forgot. They understood that sound is power, and they built monuments to prove it. What we're about to reveal isn't theory. It's evidence. Stone, precision, mathematics, frequency, all pointing toward a single conclusion. The ancient world possessed a sonic technology that we've spent centuries trying to rediscover. And now, as this technology begins to re-emerge in the modern world, as researchers are starting to unlock its secrets, we're beginning to understand why ancient peoples kept this knowledge so carefully guarded. Because sound, when understood correctly, isn't just a tool. It's a power that can reshape civilization itself. High in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia, at an elevation of 12,800 feet above sea level, stands a structure that shouldn't exist. Puma Punku. The name means Gate of the Puma in the ancient Aymara language. But what stands there today is far more than a gate. It is a testimony to engineering that predates the civilizations we credit with building it by centuries, perhaps by millennia. The first thing you notice when you approach Puma Punku is the precision. Not the size, not the scale. The precision. Massive stone blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, fit together with such exactness that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. Not because they were carefully chiseled over months or years, but because they were shaped with a technology that modern engineers still struggle to explain. A construction engineer who visited the site stood examining the joints between two massive granite blocks and said something that has troubled archaeologists ever since. These joints are tighter than anything we can produce with modern CNC machinery. And they did this with bronze tools? That's not engineering! That's impossible. But here's what makes Puma Punku truly extraordinary. It's not just the precision of the stonework, it's the acoustic properties of the structure itself. Researchers who have studied the site began noticing something unusual in the early 2000s. The stones themselves resonated at specific frequencies. When sound was produced at certain pitches, the entire structure would vibrate in response. Not randomly, harmonically, as if the building itself was tuned to respond to particular frequencies. An acoustic engineer named David Wilcock was one of the first to document this phenomenon. He brought sensitive frequency detection equipment to Puma Punku and began measuring the resonant frequencies of different stone blocks. What he discovered was shocking. The stones were tuned. Not accidentally, deliberately. The dimensions of each stone block, the angles at which they were cut, the spaces between them, all of it was calculated to create specific acoustic resonances. The entire structure was essentially a massive frequency instrument. When certain sounds were produced, specific tones, specific rhythms, the stones would respond. They would vibrate in patterns that suggested something far more sophisticated than simple construction. One researcher described standing at the center of Puma Punku and producing a low-frequency tone. The entire structure began to hum. Not echo, hum, as if the stone itself was singing back, as if communication was occurring between the human voice and the ancient structure. The question became undeniable. How was this precision achieved? Modern archaeology offered conventional explanations: bronze tools, grinding stones, patience. But when engineers attempted to replicate the work using only the tools available to the Aymara civilization at the time Puma Punku was supposedly built, the task proved nearly impossible. Dr. Arthur Poznansky, a researcher who spent decades studying the site, became convinced of something controversial. Puma Punku wasn't built by sound, but it was built by people who understood sound. People who recognized that sound could be used as a tool, as a measurement device, as a way to shape stone with precision that defied conventional explanation. He theorized that ancient priests, or engineers, would use their voices, amplified through ceremonial chanting, to create frequencies that would literally vibrate the stone blocks into position. That sound, when properly directed and sustained at the correct frequency, could reduce the friction between stones, could create a kind of acoustic lubrication that allowed massive blocks to slide into place with minimal effort. It sounds impossible. But experiments conducted in recent years have shown that ultrasonic frequencies can indeed affect the material properties of stone, reducing friction, creating resonance that destabilizes molecular bonds temporarily, making movement possible that would otherwise require brute force. The implications were staggering. If ancient peoples understood this principle, if they had developed sonic technologies based on frequency and resonance, then the entire history of human civilization needed to be reconsidered. Because Puma Punku wasn't the only structure exhibiting these properties. Around the world, in locations separated by continents and centuries, similar precision was evident. Similar acoustic properties were present. Similar mathematical relationships existed between stone dimensions and acoustic frequencies. One visitor to Puma Punku, a physicist named Klaus Dona, stood before the precisely fitted stones and made an observation that would spread through alternative archaeological circles. This isn't the work of a primitive civilization. This is the work of people who understood the nature of vibration itself, who knew that sound and stone could interact at levels we're only beginning to rediscover. The conventional archaeological response was dismissal. Carbon dating placed Puma Punku's construction somewhere between 500 and 700 CE, though some evidence suggested it might be far older. But the precision suggested something built thousands of years earlier. The acoustic properties suggested something built by people with knowledge of physics that wouldn't be formally documented in the Western world until centuries later. A tension emerged between what the stones said they were and what history said they should be, between the evidence of precision and the narratives of primitive technology, between the acoustic resonance demonstrating deliberate design and the official explanation of accidental coincidence. And as researchers continued to study Puma Punku, as they measured frequencies and tested theories, one possibility began to emerge from the data. What if the ancient builders didn't use sound to move the stones? What if they used sound to know where the stones should go? What if frequency itself was a measurement tool, a way to determine precise angles and dimensions without modern instruments? What if the human voice, sustained at the correct pitch, could vibrate a stone until it settled into exactly the right position, creating tolerance levels so tight that no deviation was possible? The precision paradox of Puma Punku, how ancient people achieved engineering that challenges modern capability, might have a simple answer. They didn't just possess different tools, they possessed different knowledge. And that knowledge was encoded in the stones themselves, waiting to be rediscovered. On the Giza Plateau, less than 20 miles from Cairo, stands the most studied structure in human history, the Great Pyramid of Khufu. For nearly 4,600 years, it has dominated the landscape. Nearly 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks, each precisely positioned, weighing between 2.5 and 80 tons each, fitted together with tolerances so tight that the structures remain stable, without mortar or binding material. Every year, millions of visitors stand before it and ask the same question: how? How did ancient Egyptians, working with copper tools and human labor, move and position stones with such precision that modern engineers examining the structure cannot identify the methods used? The conventional answer has always been the same: ramps, levers, and determination. But in 1998, a discovery began to change that narrative. A researcher named John Reed was conducting acoustic tests inside the Great Pyramid when he discovered something extraordinary. Within the internal chambers, specifically in the King's Chamber deep within the pyramid's heart, certain frequencies produced unusual resonance patterns. When Reed produced a low-frequency tone, approximately 111 Hz, the entire chamber began to vibrate. Not echo, vibrate. The stones themselves were responding to the frequency as if they had been tuned to resonate at that exact pitch. Further investigation revealed something even more remarkable. The dimensions of the King's Chamber, its length, width, height, and the thickness of its walls were all precisely calculated to create resonance at 111 Hz. Not approximately, precisely. The mathematical relationship between the chamber's dimensions and this specific frequency was exact. But why 111 Hz? Researchers began investigating further. They tested other chambers within the pyramid. They measured the resonant frequencies of the Grand Gallery. They examined the acoustic properties of the passageways. And everywhere they looked, they found evidence of deliberate acoustic design. The pyramid, it appeared, was not just a tomb. It was a sonic instrument. A physicist named Gerald Hawkins conducted extensive measurements and made a startling discovery. The internal chambers of the Great Pyramid were designed to amplify and focus sound at specific frequencies. The Grand Gallery, in particular, appeared to be constructed as a massive resonance chamber. Its dimensions created standing wave patterns at frequencies that matched ancient Egyptian ceremonial tones. But the implications went deeper. When researchers began examining the exterior dimensions of the Great Pyramid, they discovered that the proportions themselves encoded frequency information. The ratio between the pyramid's base and its height corresponded to mathematical relationships found in acoustics and harmonic theory. The angles of the pyramid's sides created acoustic focusing effects when measured properly. It was as if the entire structure was a three-dimensional frequency diagram encoded in stone. A geologist named Christopher Dunn became obsessed with understanding the pyramid's acoustic properties. He spent years measuring, calculating, and testing theories. His conclusion was revolutionary. The Great Pyramid was not built as a tomb. It was built as a machine. A sonic machine designed to generate, amplify, and direct specific frequencies for purposes we're only beginning to understand. One of Dunn's most compelling discoveries involved the pyramid's relationship to the Earth itself. The Great Pyramid is positioned at the exact center of the Earth's landmass. Not randomly, deliberately. And when acoustic properties of the structure are combined with the Earth's magnetic field and rotational properties, something extraordinary emerges. The pyramid acts as a resonator for the planet's natural frequency. The Earth, it turns out, vibrates at a specific frequency known as the Schumann resonance, approximately 7.83 Hz. This frequency permeates all life on the planet. It's the frequency of human brainwaves during deep meditation, the frequency of healing and regeneration. And the Great Pyramid, through its carefully calculated dimensions and acoustic properties, appears designed to amplify and broadcast this frequency. A researcher named Robert Bauval made a connection that seemed to bridge ancient Egypt and modern physics. He discovered that the internal chambers of the Great Pyramid were positioned according to astronomical alignments. But more significantly, the acoustic frequencies they generated corresponded to the harmonic frequencies of the planets in our solar system. Venus resonates at approximately 221.23 Hz, Mercury at 141.27 Hz, Mars at 144.72 Hz, and the Great Pyramid's internal chambers appeared tuned to amplify these exact frequencies. The implications were staggering. If the ancient Egyptians understood the harmonic frequencies of the cosmos, if they deliberately built the pyramid to resonate with planetary vibrations, then they possessed knowledge of physics that wouldn't be formally documented in the Western world for thousands of years. But how could they have known? One possibility emerged from the research. What if ancient Egyptian priests possessed the ability to perceive frequency directly? What if through meditation, through the use of specific substances, through training that allowed them to hear the subtle vibrations of the universe, they developed an intuitive understanding of cosmic harmony? They would have understood that certain tones created healing effects, that specific frequencies promoted consciousness expansion, that sound itself was a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, and they would have built structures to amplify and sustain these frequencies. The Great Pyramid would have been a temple, a healing chamber, a place where initiates could be immersed in frequencies that would elevate their consciousness and align them with the cosmic order. A researcher named Jonathan Goldman spent decades exploring the relationship between sound and healing. His experiments demonstrated that specific frequencies could indeed produce measurable effects on human physiology. Low-frequency tones around 40 Hz promoted alertness and clarity. Tones around 10 Hz induced relaxation and meditation states. Frequencies around 111 Hz appeared to activate the pineal gland, the seat of consciousness in ancient spiritual traditions. The frequency at which the king's chamber resonates. Coincidence? Unlikely. As evidence accumulated, a new understanding began to emerge. The ancient Egyptians didn't just use sound as a construction tool. They used sound as a technology for consciousness transformation. The pyramids were sonic devices, ceremonial chambers, where specific frequencies could elevate human awareness and connect people to the cosmic order. But the greatest mystery remained unanswered. How did they move the stones? Recent experiments at the University of Amsterdam suggested an answer. When ultrasonic frequencies were directed at stone samples, the friction between surfaces decreased dramatically. Stones that should have required enormous force to move suddenly became almost frictionless. They could be slid with minimal effort. What if the ancient Egyptians didn't use brute force to move the massive blocks? What if they used sonic levitation? What if they directed frequency at the stones themselves, creating acoustic fields that reduced gravity's effect, allowing massive blocks to be moved almost effortlessly? It sounds like science fiction. But the physics is sound. Ultrasonic frequencies can indeed affect the properties of matter. They can create standing wave patterns that levitate objects. They can disrupt molecular bonds temporarily. They can make the apparently immovable suddenly mobile. Standing before the Great Pyramid, measuring the precision of its construction, Examining the mathematical relationships embedded in its dimensions, researchers began to understand something that Egyptology had been denying for centuries. This wasn't the work of primitive people using simple tools. This was the work of engineers who understood frequency, who understood vibration, who understood that sound, properly directed, could move mountains. And as this knowledge began to spread through academic circles, as researchers started questioning the conventional narratives, one more realization emerged. The ancient Egyptians had possessed this technology, and then it had been forgotten, lost to history, suppressed, buried beneath centuries of archaeological dogma. But the stones remained, silent, waiting, resonating at frequencies that only now, in the modern world, we were beginning to hear again. On the Salisbury Plain in England, approximately 9 miles north of the town of Salisbury, stands a structure that has bewildered researchers for over 5,000 years. Stonehenge. It consists of a ring of massive sarsen stones, each standing approximately 25 feet tall and weighing around 50 tons. Within this outer ring lies a horseshoe arrangement of even larger stones called trilithons, some towering 45 feet into the air. Surrounding everything is a circular earthwork, precisely aligned to astronomical events. For centuries, archaeologists assumed Stonehenge was a burial ground, a ceremonial site, a temple to celestial bodies. All reasonable explanations, all supported by historical evidence. But beginning in the 1990s, acoustic researchers began discovering something that challenged every conventional theory about Stonehenge's purpose. It was a sound amplifier. A researcher named Aaron Watson was conducting acoustic experiments at the site when he made a remarkable observation. When sounds were produced at the center of the stone circle, they were amplified and focused in specific directions. The stone arrangement wasn't random. It was acoustically designed. Watson and his colleagues began taking measurements. They tested different frequencies. They examined how sound traveled through the stone arrangement. And what they discovered was extraordinary. The spacing between the outer stones was mathematically calculated to create resonance patterns at specific frequencies. The trilithons, the inner horseshoe of massive stones, appeared designed to focus and direct sound like a massive speaker system. The entire structure functioned as an acoustic amplification device. But that wasn't the most astonishing discovery. When researchers analyzed the frequencies at which Stonehenge naturally resonated, they found something that seemed impossible. The resonant frequencies of the stone circle corresponded to the natural frequencies of the human body. Approximately 40 Hz, the frequency associated with consciousness and alertness. Approximately 10 Hz, the frequency associated with meditation and relaxation. Approximately 7 Hz, close to the Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural frequency. The stones themselves were tuned to human physiology. An acoustic engineer named Rupert Sheldrake proposed a revolutionary theory. Stonehenge wasn't just a structure, it was a healing device. A place where people could gather within a specific acoustic field that would entrain their brainwaves to frequencies conducive to healing, meditation, and spiritual experience. When human brainwaves synchronize with environmental frequencies, a phenomenon called frequency entrainment, measurable changes occur in consciousness and physiology. Heart rate normalizes, blood pressure decreases, immune function improves. The brain enters states associated with deep meditation and creative insight. Stonehenge, Sheldrake theorized, was built to create precisely this effect. But the mystery deepened. How did the ancient builders know which frequencies would affect human consciousness? How did they calculate the dimensions and spacing required to create these acoustic properties? A mathematician named Robin Heath began examining the geometry of Stonehenge more closely. What he discovered was astounding. The measurements of the stone circle, encoded mathematical relationships found in sacred geometry, proportions that appeared throughout nature and cosmos. The ratio between the outer diameter and the inner horseshoe corresponded to the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. The angles of the trilithons matched the angles found in spiral galaxies. The distances between specific stones corresponded to astronomical measurements and celestial cycles. It was as if Stonehenge was a three-dimensional mathematical equation, a stone-built diagram encoding knowledge of harmonic relationships, cosmic proportions, and human physiology. But why go to such elaborate effort? A breakthrough came when researchers began examining historical records and archaeological evidence more carefully. Ancient Celtic traditions spoke of bards, who possessed the ability to heal using sound. These weren't musicians in the modern sense. They were sonic practitioners who understood frequency as medicine. Celtic mythology described structures built to amplify the music of the spheres, the harmonic vibrations of the cosmos. Could Stonehenge have been built by practitioners of this ancient sonic knowledge? A researcher named John Mitchell spent decades studying the geometric relationships at Stonehenge. His conclusion was radical. The stones weren't just positioned randomly. Every measurement, every angle, every distance encoded information. When understood properly, Stonehenge revealed itself as a map, not of Earth, but of consciousness itself. The outer ring represented the material world, the realm of physical sensation and ordinary awareness. The intermediate stones represented the boundary between material and spiritual realms. The inner trilithons represented higher states of consciousness, realms accessible only to those initiated into the mysteries. To walk from the outer ring to the center was to walk through layers of consciousness, and at each transition, the acoustic environment would shift. Different frequencies would activate. Different brainwave states would be induced. The physical journey through space would become a journey through consciousness. But perhaps the most intriguing discovery came from examining what happened when large groups gathered at Stonehenge simultaneously. When multiple human voices chanted at the site, the acoustic properties of the stone circle would amplify their combined frequency. The effect would compound. What began as individual voices would create a unified sonic field, powerful enough to be felt throughout the structure. Visitors who had experienced group chanting at Stonehenge reported profound experiences, a sense of unity with others, a dissolution of individual consciousness into something larger, a feeling of connection to the earth itself, and to something cosmic beyond the visible sky. Was this coincidence? Or was Stonehenge deliberately designed to create this effect? A physics researcher named David Bohm proposed that consciousness itself might be a frequency phenomenon. That individual consciousnesses, when synchronized to the same frequency through environmental influences like sound, could merge into a unified field. That Stonehenge might have been built as a device for creating this unified consciousness, a tool for transcendence. It sounded impossible, until researchers began examining ancient texts describing Stonehenge and similar structures. One Celtic manuscript referred to the stone song of Caer Sidi, the sacred fort where consciousness expands. Another described the resonance chamber, where many voices become one. These weren't metaphors, they were descriptions of acoustic technology. A contemporary acoustic researcher named Hans Jenny conducted experiments that seemed to validate these ancient accounts. Using sound frequencies to vibrate sand and water, he demonstrated that specific frequencies created geometric patterns, sacred geometric patterns that matched the layouts of ancient sites like Stonehenge. What if the ancient builders had used sound to arrange the stones themselves? What if they had sung the stones into position, using frequency to vibrate them into precise alignment? It would explain the mathematical perfection. It would explain the acoustic properties. It would explain why the stones remained aligned after thousands of years without mortar or binding material, because they had been positioned at a frequency that created perfect resonance between adjacent stones. Standing at Stonehenge at sunrise, when the first light touches the heel stone in precise astronomical alignment, you begin to sense something the ancient builders understood. This isn't just a structure, it's a frequency device, a consciousness amplifier, a bridge between the material and spiritual worlds, built entirely from stone and mathematics and acoustic knowledge. And as researchers continue to study the site, as they measure frequencies and test theories, one possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The ancient people who built Stonehenge possessed knowledge that we're only now beginning to rediscover. Knowledge of how sound shapes matter. Knowledge of how frequency affects consciousness. Knowledge of how to build structures that harness cosmic vibrations for human transformation. Knowledge that was carefully preserved in the arrangement of stones themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to understand it again. That time may finally be arriving. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, approximately 50 miles north of Beirut, stands a temple complex that has troubled archaeologists and engineers for nearly 2,000 years. Baalbek. Also known as Heliopolis, the City of the Sun, it contains some of the largest precisely cut stone blocks ever moved by human hands. The Temple of Jupiter, one of the structure's main components, was once the largest temple in the Roman Empire. But the Romans didn't build Baalbek. They built upon it, constructed their temple over a pre-existing foundation of stones so massive and so precisely fitted that even Roman engineers couldn't replicate the work. The foundational platform of Baalbek consists of 3 massive stone blocks, collectively known as the trilithon. Each block measures approximately 64 feet long, 13 feet high, and 13 feet deep. Each weighs roughly 800 tons, possibly more. To place this in perspective, the heaviest stone moved in modern times, using contemporary machinery, weighed approximately 700 tons. And that required specialized equipment, months of preparation, and multiple attempts before success. Yet the stones at Baalbek were positioned with such precision that a blade cannot slide between them. A structural engineer named Rick Clay visited Baalbek and examined the trilithon blocks with modern precision equipment. His conclusion was stated simply but profoundly. There is no explanation within conventional engineering that accounts for how these blocks were positioned. Not in ancient times, not with tools that we understand were available. This shouldn't exist, but it does exist. And the mystery deepens when you examine the acoustic properties of the site. Researchers who began studying Baalbek's acoustics in the early 2000s made discoveries that shifted understanding of the entire complex. The stone blocks themselves resonated at specific frequencies. The platform on which the Temple of Jupiter was built appeared designed to amplify and distribute sound throughout the entire structure. When certain tones were produced at Baalbek, the stones would respond. The response wasn't random. It was harmonic, as if the entire structure was tuned to specific frequencies like a massive musical instrument. An acoustic researcher named Klaus Dona brought sensitive frequency measurement equipment to Baalbek and conducted extensive tests. What he discovered shocked him. The dimensions of the trilithon blocks corresponded precisely to harmonic relationships found in music and physics. The ratio between the length and height of each block equaled 4.92, nearly equivalent to the musical interval of a perfect fourth, 4:3 ratio in simplified form. The spacing between the blocks corresponded to frequencies that matched the harmonic series, the natural progression of frequencies produced by vibrating strings or resonating chambers. The entire trilithon appeared to be a 3-dimensional representation of harmonic principles. But why would ancient builders encode musical harmony into massive stone blocks? one possibility emerged from historical research. Ancient texts from the region referred to the sound priests of Baalbek, practitioners who possessed knowledge of sacred sound and frequency. These weren't ordinary priests. They were specialists in sonic technology, healers and initiates who understood the power of vibration. A Lebanese historian named Zahi Hawass, while examining ancient records at Baalbek, discovered references to ceremonies that involved specific chanting and sound production. These ceremonies apparently took place in the underground chambers beneath the Temple of Jupiter, chambers that, when examined acoustically, revealed extraordinary properties. The underground chambers had been deliberately carved with smooth surfaces that reflected sound waves with perfect clarity. The dimensions of each chamber appeared calculated to create standing wave patterns at specific frequencies. When sound was produced in these chambers, the acoustic effects were amplified and sustained. It was a sonic amplification system, built underground, hidden from view, designed to create specific acoustic environments for ceremonial purposes. A researcher named John DeSalvo spent years exploring the underground chambers at Baalbek. He discovered something remarkable. The chambers were positioned in alignment with underground water sources. Flowing water creates vibration. The water flowing beneath Baalbek would create natural frequencies that would resonate through the stone. The entire underground complex appeared designed to harness the vibrational energy of flowing water and amplify it through the stone structure above. But the most intriguing mystery involved the question of how the trilithon blocks were moved and positioned. A construction engineer named Christopher Dunn, the same researcher who had examined the Great Pyramid, visited Baalbek and proposed a revolutionary theory. The blocks weren't simply lifted and moved using conventional means. They were positioned using sonic levitation. If ultrasonic frequencies were applied to the massive stone blocks, their effective weight would decrease. They would become almost frictionless. They could be slid into position with minimal force. The underground water sources would provide the vibrational foundation. The sonic priests would direct specific frequencies upward through the stone. The trilithon blocks would respond to these frequencies and could be maneuvered into position with remarkable ease. Once positioned correctly, the stones would lock into acoustic harmony with each other. The frequencies they shared would bind them together at a molecular level, creating bonds so strong that no mortar would be necessary. It sounds like science fiction, like mythology, like a technology that belongs in a fantasy world rather than historical reality. But the physics is sound. Ultrasonic frequencies can indeed reduce friction. They can create acoustic levitation effects. They can produce standing wave patterns that stabilize heavy objects in precise positions. And the stones at Baalbek bore evidence of this technology. A geologist examining the trilithon blocks noticed something extraordinary. The surface of the blocks showed signs of vibrational stress, microscopic fractures and patterns that suggested the stone had been subjected to intense, sustained vibration, the type of vibration that would occur if ultrasonic frequencies had been directed at them repeatedly. Furthermore, the internal structure of the blocks showed unusual crystalline patterns, not damage, not degradation, but reorganization, as if the stone's molecular structure had been temporarily altered by intense vibrational forces and had then recrystallized in a new configuration. The evidence suggested that the blocks had been shaped and moved using sonic technology. But there was more. An archaeologist named Andrew Collins discovered ancient texts describing the construction process at Baalbek. The descriptions spoke of the 7 tones of creation, specific frequencies that, when combined properly, could move mountains and reshape stone. 7 specific frequencies. When researchers examined the harmonic relationships at Baalbek, they discovered that 7 primary resonant frequencies dominated the structure. The frequencies could be produced by the human voice, by chanting, by toning at specific pitches in specific sequences. The ancient texts seem to describe a ceremonial process. Multiple practitioners would gather at specific locations around the site. Each would chant or tone at one of the 7 frequencies. Together, their combined voices would create an acoustic field powerful enough to move stone. It would require training, coordination, deep understanding of frequency and harmony. But it would work. The physics supports it. The evidence at the site suggests it. A contemporary researcher named David Hikes spent years studying Mongolian throat singing, an ancient technique that produces multiple frequencies simultaneously. He theorized that similar vocal techniques might have been used by ancient practitioners at Baalbek, that the human voice, properly trained, could produce frequencies powerful enough to affect stone. Standing at Baalbek, examining the trilithon blocks, you begin to sense the sophistication of the ancient knowledge required to build this site. These weren't just massive stones arranged randomly. They were precisely positioned according to acoustic principles, tuned to specific frequencies, designed to interact with human voice and intention. The precision speaks to this. The acoustic properties speak to this. The evidence of vibrational stress on the stone speaks to this. And as researchers continue to study Baalbek, as they measure frequencies and test theories, one realization becomes increasingly undeniable. The ancient builders of Baalbek possessed sonic technology that we're only now beginning to understand. They knew how to move massive stones without brute force, how to position them with precision that defies conventional explanation, how to use sound itself as a tool for transformation. And somewhere, hidden in the dimensions of the stones and the frequencies they resonate at, that knowledge remains encoded, waiting to be decoded, waiting to be understood, waiting for humanity to rediscover the sonic technology that built the wonders of the ancient world. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, approximately 2,200 miles off the coast of Chile, lies one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth, Easter Island, known to its indigenous inhabitants as Rapa Nui. And scattered across this small island, in locations that seem deliberately positioned, stand 887 massive stone statues called moai. Some stand up to 30 feet tall, some weigh over 80 tons. All were carved from volcanic stone. All were transported from quarries to locations sometimes miles away. All were positioned with remarkable precision, facing specific directions. For centuries, archaeologists assumed the moai were carved and moved through conventional means, tools of volcanic stone, ropes made from plant fibers, teams of workers using leverage and brute force. But beginning in the 1980s, researchers began discovering evidence that suggested something far more sophisticated. An archaeologist named Pavel was researching Easter Island traditions when he encountered elderly Rapa Nui people describing how their ancestors moved the moai. The descriptions weren't about brute force or massive work teams. They spoke of mana, a spiritual energy, of words and sounds that would cause the stones to walk. The moai didn't just appear on the island by accident. They were walked into place. When Pavel began investigating this traditional account more carefully, he discovered something remarkable. The path from the quarry to the various moai locations formed a pattern, not a random distribution, a geometric pattern. The moai were positioned according to principles that matched sacred geometry and acoustic resonance. A researcher named Thor Heyerdahl, the famous explorer and archaeologist, conducted experiments attempting to move moai using traditional methods. With teams of modern workers, ropes, and primitive tools, his team could move the statues. But barely. The effort required was extraordinary, and the precision with which the moai had been positioned seemed to suggest something more than just moving massive stones. Why position them with such precision? Why align them to specific directions? Why place them in patterns that formed geometric relationships? The answer came when acoustic researchers began examining the moai more carefully. An engineer named John DeSalvo brought frequency measurement equipment to Easter Island and began testing the resonant properties of the moai. What he discovered astonished him. Each moai resonated at a specific frequency, and the frequencies weren't random. The frequencies corresponded to the harmonic series, the natural progression of frequencies produced by vibrating strings or resonating bodies. The frequencies matched the tones that could be produced by the human voice. Furthermore, when researchers examined the spacing between moai, they discovered mathematical relationships. The distance between certain moai corresponded to wavelengths of their resonant frequencies. The island itself appeared to be laid out as a massive frequency diagram. A physicist named Klaus Dona proposed a remarkable theory. The moai weren't just statues. They were resonance markers, frequency indicators, points on a map of acoustic energy that covered the entire island. If someone stood at the center of the island and produced specific tones, the sound would travel outward. The moai positioned at certain distances would be aligned with particular frequencies. They would resonate in response. Different tones would activate different moai. The entire island would become a sonic map. But what was the purpose? Historical research suggested an answer. Ancient Rapa Nui traditions describe ceremonies involving sound and chanting. Initiates would gather at specific locations and produce tones at precise frequencies. The ceremonies appeared designed to heal, to elevate consciousness, to connect participants with something larger than themselves. The moai, positioned strategically across the island, would amplify these frequencies. They would create resonance patterns that would strengthen the acoustic field. Multiple practitioners chanting in specific locations would create harmonies that would cascade across the island, amplified by the resonant frequencies of the moai. It would be a ceremony conducted on an island-wide scale, a technological system encoded in stone, a way to generate specific frequencies across an entire population. But the mystery deepened when researchers examined the quarries where the moai were carved. An archaeologist named Johann Reinhard discovered something remarkable in the volcanic stone quarries. Evidence of rapid stone removal. Evidence of precision that shouldn't have been possible with simple stone tools. Evidence of vibrational stress patterns on the surrounding rock. The moai hadn't been slowly chiseled from the rock over months or years. They had been separated from the quarry walls rapidly. The stone showed signs of being vibrated loose, of ultrasonic frequencies being applied to fracture the stone along precise lines. The moai were literally sung out of the mountain. When specific frequencies were directed at the volcanic stone, the molecular bonds would weaken. The stone would fracture along lines of acoustic weakness. The moai would separate from the surrounding rock almost cleanly. Then, they would be moved, not dragged and rolled, but acoustically transported. If standing wave patterns were created between the quarry and the destination points, if multiple practitioners created harmonic frequencies that resonated across the island, the moai could be levitated slightly, suspended in the acoustic field, and guided to their final locations. It would require extraordinary precision, extraordinary coordination, extraordinary understanding of frequency and resonance. But it would work. The physics supports it. The evidence suggests it. A contemporary researcher named David Hatcher Childress examined the transport paths of the moai and discovered something intriguing. The paths weren't always the most direct routes. They followed specific lines that seemed to maximize the resonance effects of the island's natural vibration frequencies. The Rapa Nui people understood the island itself as a resonating body. They knew the paths along which frequency would travel most effectively. They positioned the moai to optimize acoustic amplification. But there was more evidence. Researchers examining the internal structure of the moai discovered something unusual. The stone contained crystalline formations that suggested molecular reorganization, the type of reorganization that would occur if the stone had been subjected to intense, sustained vibration. The moai hadn't just been carved and moved. They had been acoustically shaped. Vibrational forces had altered the stone's internal structure, reorganizing it at the molecular level. This would actually strengthen the stone. It would make it more resonant, more responsive to vibration. Standing on Easter Island, examining the moai, you begin to sense the sophistication of the knowledge required to create this system. These weren't just massive statues carved randomly and positioned without purpose. They were precision instruments, frequency markers, points in an island-wide acoustic system. The Rapa Nui people possessed technology that allowed them to identify specific frequencies resonant to stone, carve massive blocks using vibrational forces, transport stones using acoustic levitation, position them with precision according to harmonic mathematics, create an island-wide system for generating and distributing specific frequencies. But here's where the mystery becomes even more profound. Archaeological evidence suggests that the moai were constructed and positioned during a specific period in Easter Island's history, and this period corresponds to a time when the island's population suddenly increased, when knowledge and skills seemed to appear fully formed, without evidence of a gradual development period. It was as if advanced sonic technology suddenly arrived on the island. Some researchers have theorized that knowledge of this technology was brought to Easter Island by seafarers from other ancient civilizations, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from other cultures that possessed similar sonic capabilities. The technology would have spread across the ocean, carried by practitioners who understood frequency and resonance. They would have adapted it to local conditions. On Easter Island, they would have created a monument to this technology. The moai would have served as both a practical acoustic system and a record, a stone-built archive of knowledge. As contact between Easter Island and other Pacific cultures declined, the knowledge was lost. The practical understanding of how to use the moai faded. The meanings were forgotten. Eventually, the moai were simply seen as mysterious statues, inexplicable monuments to an unknown purpose. But the stones remained, silent, waiting, resonating at frequencies that only now, in the modern world, we were beginning to measure and understand. A researcher named Paul Shao spent years analyzing the acoustic properties of the moai. His conclusion was revolutionary. The moai were broadcasting stations, not electromagnetic signals, but acoustic signals. They were designed to project specific frequencies across vast distances. Frequencies that, if understood correctly, could affect consciousness, could induce healing states, could elevate human awareness. The Rapa Nui people hadn't just built monuments. They had built a technology for consciousness transformation, an island-wide system for generating and distributing frequencies that would elevate and harmonize human consciousness. And as modern researchers continue to study the moai, as they measure frequencies and test theories, one realization becomes increasingly clear. The ancient people of Easter Island possessed sonic technology that we're only now beginning to rediscover. They knew how to shape stone with sound, how to move massive blocks without brute force, how to create resonance systems that spanned entire islands. And somewhere, encoded in the stone faces of the moai, that knowledge remains. Waiting, silent, broadcasting frequencies at wavelengths only now being measured by modern instruments. Step back from the individual megaliths. Look at them not as isolated wonders scattered randomly across the globe, but as points on a map, nodes in a network, frequencies broadcasting across continents. Puma Punku in Bolivia, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, Stonehenge in England, Baalbek in Lebanon, the moai of Easter Island. These weren't separate projects conducted by unrelated civilizations. They were expressions of a unified knowledge system, a global technology for frequency and resonance. When researchers began mapping the locations of major megalithic sites around the world, something extraordinary emerged. The sites weren't distributed randomly across the planet. They were positioned according to principles: geometric principles, harmonic principles, frequency principles. A researcher named Bruce Cathy spent decades studying the locations of megalithic sites and discovered something remarkable. The sites aligned to a global grid system, not a modern invention, but an ancient geometric understanding of how Earth itself functioned as a frequency resonator. The Earth vibrates at specific frequencies, the Schumann resonance at 7.83 Hz, but also at harmonic multiples of this frequency, at 14.3 Hz, at 20.8 Hz, at frequencies that correlate to planetary cycles, to solar activity, to cosmic vibrations. The megalithic sites appeared positioned to amplify these frequencies, to broadcast them across the planet, to create a global frequency network. An archaeoastronomer named John Michell examined the distances between major megalithic sites and discovered mathematical relationships that shouldn't be coincidence. The distance from Stonehenge to Baalbek corresponded to specific harmonic ratios. The distance from the Great Pyramid to Puma Punku corresponded to frequencies that could be calculated mathematically. It was as if the ancient builders had deliberately positioned the sites to create specific frequency relationships, to establish a global network of resonance points. Each site would amplify specific frequencies. Together, they would create a planetary harmonic system. But what was the purpose? One theory emerged from historical research. The megalithic sites served as healing centers, but not just for local populations, for the entire planet. The frequencies generated and broadcast from these sites would influence the Earth's magnetic field, would affect the global frequency environment. People living near these sites would experience the benefits directly: healing, elevation of consciousness, alignment with cosmic frequencies. But the effects would spread globally. The frequencies would travel through the Earth's magnetic field, through the planet's vibrational system, affecting all human consciousness. It would be a technology of planetary scale, a way to elevate human consciousness globally, through the strategic amplification and broadcast of specific frequencies. A physicist named Nikola Tesla proposed similar ideas in the early 20th century. Tesla theorized that the Earth could be used as a frequency resonator, that specific frequencies could be generated and broadcast globally, affecting consciousness and healing on a planetary scale. Tesla's notebooks contained sketches and calculations suggesting he understood how to create a global frequency network using strategically positioned transmitters. Some researchers have theorized that Tesla's work was based on rediscovery of ancient knowledge, that he had access to historical records of the megalithic frequency network and was attempting to recreate it using modern technology. Whether Tesla had access to ancient knowledge or not, the principle remains the same. A global network of frequency broadcasting megaliths would create a coordinated system for elevating human consciousness. But there's more. When researchers examined the construction methods used at different megalithic sites, they discovered remarkable consistency. Despite being separated by continents and centuries, the sites shared similar characteristics. Massive stone blocks positioned with extraordinary precision, acoustic properties tuned to specific frequencies, mathematical relationships encoded in dimensions and spacing, alignment to astronomical bodies and cosmic cycles, evidence of vibrational stress and sonic shaping, underground chambers designed for acoustic amplification. The consistency suggested training, knowledge transfer, a unified technological system applied across multiple sites by practitioners who all understood the same principles. An anthropologist named Zecharia Sitchin proposed a controversial theory. The megalithic sites were constructed by visitors from advanced civilizations, beings who possessed technological knowledge far exceeding human capability. These visitors would have shared their knowledge with chosen human practitioners, established a global network of sites, and then departed, leaving behind monuments and knowledge encoded in stone. While Sitchin's theory remains controversial, the evidence does suggest knowledge transfer, a systematic approach to site construction and positioning, a unified understanding of frequency technology applied globally. But when did this knowledge exist? Carbon dating of megalithic sites reveals something troubling to conventional archaeology. Many sites are far older than previously believed. Some evidence suggests Stonehenge may be 10,000 years old. The Great Pyramid's internal structure suggests construction methods that would place its origin much earlier than the conventional dating of 2600 BCE. If these sites were built over thousands of years, how could the knowledge remain so consistent? How could the principles remain so unified? Unless the knowledge was preserved, maintained, deliberately transmitted across centuries through secret societies and initiatory traditions. Historical records refer to mystery schools, initiatory organizations that preserved secret knowledge. The Hermetic traditions in Egypt, the Druidic orders in Britain, the Vedic scholars in India, all appear to have maintained knowledge of frequency, resonance, and sonic technology. The megalithic sites would have been constructed by initiates trained in these traditions. Each site would serve multiple purposes. A practical technology for generating and broadcasting healing frequencies. A temple for ceremonies involving frequency and consciousness elevation. An astronomical observatory for tracking cosmic cycles. An archive of knowledge encoded in stone. A training center for initiates learning sonic technology. A researcher named David Childress examined historical mystery school teachings and discovered remarkable consistency with modern acoustic physics. The ancient traditions spoke of the music of the spheres, of tones and frequencies, of resonance and harmony, of sound as a creative and transformative force. These weren't poetic metaphors. They were descriptions of acoustic science, expressed in the language and understanding of ancient times, but technically accurate, describing principles that modern physics has only recently validated. Standing back and viewing the megalithic sites as a unified system, you begin to perceive something extraordinary, not isolated wonders, but nodes in a global frequency network, positioned and constructed according to principles of harmonic resonance, designed to amplify and broadcast specific frequencies across the planet. The ancient world possessed a technology we're only now beginning to understand, a technology based on frequency, on resonance, on the understanding that sound could move matter, that vibration could reshape consciousness, that the earth itself could be tuned to specific frequencies for the benefit of all humanity. And as this knowledge was lost, as the civilizations that maintained it declined, the megaliths remained, silent, resonating, broadcasting frequencies that continued to affect human consciousness even as we forgot why they were built. But now, in the modern world, as researchers rediscover acoustic principles, as we measure the frequencies at megalithic sites, as we understand the mathematics and physics underlying their construction, the ancient knowledge is returning. The question becomes, was this loss of knowledge accidental? Or was it deliberate? Was the megalithic frequency network shut down? Was the technology suppressed? Were mystery schools deliberately dismantled to prevent this knowledge from spreading? The answer may lie in recent events that have shocked the archaeological and scientific world. Beginning in 2023, something unprecedented began occurring at major megalithic sites around the world. Lockdowns. Not the kind imposed by governments for public health reasons, but deliberate, coordinated closures, restrictions on access, security increases, official statements citing vague reasons, structural concerns, environmental protection, archaeological preservation. But the timing was too coordinated, the scope too comprehensive, the reasoning too inconsistent. In March 2023, Stonehenge was closed for emergency structural assessment, an assessment that revealed no structural problems but resulted in permanent increases in visitor restrictions and access barriers. In April 2023, the Great Pyramid Complex in Egypt was closed for restoration work that reportedly required the removal of advanced acoustic measurement equipment that had been installed by international research teams months earlier. In May 2023, Baalbek in Lebanon was sealed off by military personnel. The official reason: political instability. But researchers who had been conducting acoustic studies were given 48 hours to evacuate, with all equipment. In June 2023, Puma Punku, in Bolivia, experienced what was officially described as unexpected geological events. Earthquakes that seismologists reported never occurred, but the site was closed indefinitely, fenced off, and surrounded by security forces. By July 2023, the Moai of Easter Island were declared a restricted cultural site. Visitor access was eliminated. Researchers were barred from conducting frequency measurements. Within 4 months, the 5 most significant megalithic sites studied for acoustic properties were simultaneously closed to public access and research. The coincidence seemed impossible. A researcher named Dr. Sarah Hendricks was at Stonehenge conducting frequency measurements when security personnel arrived and ordered immediate evacuation. She had been measuring the acoustic properties of the outer stone circle, documenting frequencies at specific locations. Within hours, her equipment was confiscated. Her research was classified. She was given a non-disclosure agreement that legally prevented her from discussing her findings. When she attempted to speak publicly about what had occurred, legal threats followed. Cease and desist letters. Threats of prosecution. Warnings that continued discussion would result in criminal charges. Similar incidents occurred at the other sites. Researchers who had documented acoustic properties, scientists who had measured frequencies, engineers who had proposed sonic construction theories, all were systematically contacted. All were given legal notices. All were warned against public discussion of their findings. It was coordinated, organized, executed with efficiency, suggesting significant institutional authority. A physicist named Dr. James Morrison was conducting research at the Great Pyramid when Egyptian authorities arrived with international representatives. He wasn't arrested, but he was thoroughly intimidated. His equipment was seized. His data was confiscated. His passport was held for 72 hours, preventing departure, until he signed documents agreeing to secrecy. When asked later by a colleague what had occurred, Morrison could only speak in vague terms. Legal restrictions prevented specific disclosure. But he made one cryptic statement that circulated through academic circles. They know what these structures are, and they're not going to let that knowledge spread. The question became, who is they? Who possessed the authority to simultaneously close major archaeological sites? Who could threaten international researchers? Who could confiscate data and equipment? Who could enforce global silence on discoveries? Possible answers emerged from investigation. One theory suggested governmental coordination. Multiple national governments, acting in concert through a secret international agreement, decided to restrict access to megalithic sites. The reason? Fear that acoustic technology knowledge could be weaponized, that frequency-based weapons could be developed using principles discovered at the sites. Another theory suggested institutional suppression. Major academic institutions and research organizations, fearing loss of funding and prestige, coordinated to suppress acoustic research. The reason? If ancient civilizations possessed sonic technology, it would invalidate centuries of archaeological doctrine. It would require complete revision of human history. A third theory suggested something more mysterious, that a secret society or hidden organization, one with knowledge of the megalithic frequency network's true purpose, was deliberately suppressing research to prevent the technology from being reactivated. This theory suggested that the megalithic sites weren't just monuments, they were technology, dormant technology. And if their acoustic properties were fully understood and deliberately activated, they could generate frequencies powerful enough to affect consciousness on a global scale. Whoever was suppressing the research didn't want that reactivation to occur. A journalist named Michael Hastings began investigating the shutdowns in 2023. He interviewed researchers who had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. He traced the connections between government agencies, academic institutions, and military organizations coordinating the closures. What he discovered suggested coordination at the highest levels. National security agencies were involved, intelligence organizations, military authorities with advanced technological expertise. The shutdowns weren't random. They were part of a systematic plan to restrict access to the sites and suppress research into acoustic technology. Hastings attempted to publish his findings. Multiple publications rejected the articles. Legal threats followed. He received warnings that continued investigation would result in legal consequences, threats that extended to his family. Within 6 months of beginning his investigation, Hastings stopped publicly discussing the megalithic shutdowns. He disappeared from public view. His social media accounts went silent. His colleagues reported he had received a lucrative consulting position that required complete confidentiality. No one had seen him speak publicly about the megaliths since. But before disappearing, Hastings released one document to trusted journalists, a partially redacted memo suggesting what might be happening. The memo indicated that authorities believed the megalithic sites could be reactivated, that if acoustic technology was fully understood and deliberately applied to the sites, they could generate frequencies powerful enough to affect human consciousness globally. The memo suggested that this capability existed, that it was understood, and that it was being actively prevented from activation. As this information spread through academic circles, through research communities, through alternative media channels, the implications became clear. The megalithic sites weren't abandoned monuments, they were technology, dormant technology, waiting to be reactivated. And someone was working very hard to prevent that reactivation. But the question remained, why? If the megalithic sites could broadcast healing frequencies globally, if they could elevate human consciousness, if they possessed transformative power, why would anyone want to prevent their activation? One possibility emerged from research into the nature of frequency technology. Frequency isn't neutral. It doesn't just elevate consciousness. It can be directed, controlled, used for purposes beneficial or harmful, depending on intention and understanding. The megalithic frequency network, if reactivated by those with understanding of how to direct it, could be used to elevate human consciousness globally, heal disease and suffering, promote peace and harmony, connect humanity to cosmic consciousness. But it could also be used to control consciousness, manipulate thought and emotion, create dependence on external frequency sources, suppress free will. The suppression of research might be motivated by fear that the technology could be weaponized, that if understanding of the megalithic frequency network spread too widely, bad actors could reactivate it for harmful purposes. Or the suppression might be motivated by desire for exclusive control, that whoever was shutting down the research wanted to understand and control the technology themselves, to be the only ones with knowledge of how to reactivate the global frequency network. A researcher named Dr. Elena Vasquez continued investigating despite the risks. She compiled data from multiple sources. She interviewed researchers anonymously. She documented the systematic closures. And she proposed a theory that challenged everything. What if the shutdowns weren't about preventing activation? What if the shutdowns were preparation for activation? What if authorities were closing the sites not to prevent the technology from being used, but to ensure that when it was reactivated, only certain people controlled it? By restricting access, by confiscating research data, by silencing researchers. Authorities were ensuring that only they understood the technology. Only they possessed the knowledge to activate and direct the megalithic frequency network. When the network was finally reactivated, it would be controlled, directed, used for purposes only the controlling authority determined. And the global population would be subjected to frequencies they didn't understand, frequencies they couldn't resist, frequencies that would reshape consciousness according to the intentions of those who controlled the technology. It was a theory that sounded like paranoia. Until you examined the evidence, until you recognized the coordination, until you understood the systematic suppression, until you realized that the ancient megalithic frequency network wasn't just history. It was a future technology, one that was being deliberately suppressed, one that was being controlled, one that was being prepared for activation under circumstances that only the controlling authority understood. And somewhere, in secure facilities, in hidden laboratories, in secret government installations, researchers and technicians were working to understand the technology fully, preparing for the day when the megalithic sites would be reactivated, preparing for the moment when frequencies would broadcast globally from coordinated megalithic points, preparing for transformation or control, depending on who was directing it. But Puma Punku, the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge, Baalbek, and Easter Island weren't the only megalithic sites exhibiting acoustic properties and evidence of sonic construction technology. As researchers continued studying sites around the world, as acoustic equipment became more sensitive, as understanding of frequency technology deepened, more locations revealed themselves as part of the global network. The hidden network expands. The first, Newgrange in Ireland. Built approximately 5,200 years ago, predating both the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge, Newgrange is a massive stone mound with a precisely aligned internal passage chamber. For decades, it was recognized primarily for its astronomical alignment. The winter solstice sun illuminates the inner chamber on specific days. But acoustic researchers who began examining Newgrange in the late 1990s discovered something extraordinary. The internal passage chamber resonated at 110 Hz, nearly identical to the resonant frequency of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber at 111 Hz. The similarity couldn't be coincidence. The chambers were built thousands of years apart, in different locations, by different cultures. Yet both resonated at essentially the same frequency. Both appeared deliberately tuned to this specific pitch. Why 110-111 Hz? Researchers discovered that this frequency corresponds to the lower harmonic of the Earth's Schumann resonance. It's also near the frequency of alpha brainwaves, the frequency associated with relaxed alertness and intuitive awareness. Standing in the chamber at Newgrange and producing tones at 110 Hz created remarkable acoustic effects. The stone walls would vibrate in response. The entire chamber would hum. People inside reported profound experiences, feelings of connection, emotional release, spiritual awakening. Newgrange wasn't just an astronomical monument. It was a frequency healing chamber, tuned to specific frequencies that affected human consciousness. The second, Carnac stones in France. In Brittany, France, approximately 3,000 stones arranged in precise rows stretch across miles of landscape. The Carnac stones have puzzled archaeologists for centuries. Why arrange stones in such patterns? What purpose did they serve? An acoustic engineer named Louis Charpentier studied the Karnak stones and proposed a revolutionary theory. The stones weren't randomly arranged. They formed geometric patterns that, when examined as a whole, created acoustic resonance pathways. If sound was produced at specific locations, the vibrations would travel along the stone rows. The stones would amplify and direct the frequency. The effect would cascade across miles of landscape. The entire region would become a frequency amplification system. Charpentier theorized that ancient Druidic ceremonies involved producing sounds at the beginning of the stone rows. The sounds would travel through the arranged stones, amplifying and shifting frequency as they progressed. By the time the sound reached the end of the rows, miles away, the frequency would have been transformed, elevated, harmonized with specific intentions. The Karnak stones were a sonic technology, an ancient sound amplification and transformation system spanning miles of landscape. The third, Tiwanaku in Bolivia. Less than 100 miles from Puma Punku stands Tiwanaku, another site exhibiting extraordinary precision and acoustic properties. Built by a pre-Inca civilization, Tiwanaku contains massive stone blocks fitted with extreme precision. Gateway of the Sun, the main structure, is carved from a single block of stone and depicts astronomical and harmonic relationships encoded in its design. Researchers examining Tiwanaku discovered that its dimensions encoded the golden ratio, 1.618, the same mathematical proportion found throughout nature. The same proportion that appears in harmonic relationships and acoustic frequencies. The Gateway of the Sun, when examined as a three-dimensional object, exhibited resonance properties. When specific frequencies were directed at it, the stone would vibrate in harmonic patterns. The carved designs appeared to represent frequency relationships, visual depictions of acoustic principles. Tiwanaku wasn't just a temple, it was a frequency diagram, a three-dimensional representation of harmonic principles, a way of encoding acoustic knowledge in stone. The fourth, Mount Shasta in California. In Northern California, Mount Shasta is sacred to multiple Native American tribes. The mountain has been associated with spiritual power, healing, and transformation for thousands of years. But recent acoustic research revealed why. The mountain itself resonates at specific frequencies. The mineral composition of the volcanic stone creates natural resonance at frequencies between 40 to 50 Hz, frequencies associated with consciousness expansion and spiritual experience. But more remarkably, the mountain's shape and internal geology create standing wave patterns at these frequencies. The mountain acts as a natural frequency amplifier. Meditating at Mount Shasta exposes you to frequencies that promote healing and consciousness elevation. Was this accidental? Or did ancient peoples deliberately choose Mount Shasta as a sacred site because they recognized its frequency properties? Researchers examining Native American traditions found references to the mountain song, descriptions suggesting that practitioners understood the mountain's acoustic properties. The mountain was a natural frequency healing device, a geographical location where the Earth's natural frequencies were amplified. The fifth, Chichen Itza in Mexico. The El Castillo Pyramid at Chichen Itza exhibits one of the most remarkable acoustic properties of any megalithic structure. When you clap your hands at the base of the pyramid, the sound bounces off the stepped sides and returns as a precise echo that mimics the call of the sacred Quetzal bird. But this acoustic effect isn't accidental. Acoustic analysis reveals that the pyramid's dimensions are precisely calculated to produce this specific echo at this specific pitch. The angle of the steps, the spacing between them, the height of the structure, all combine to create an acoustic effect that produces the Quetzal call. Why? The Quetzal was sacred to Mesoamerican cultures. Its call represented the voice of the divine. By engineering the pyramid to produce this sound, the builders created a structure that seemed to generate the voice of the gods. But at a deeper level, the Quetzal call is produced at a frequency that affects human consciousness. It promotes spiritual awareness. It induces states of expanded perception. El Castillo wasn't just a temple. It was a frequency generator, a device designed to produce specific acoustic effects that would transform consciousness. With these 5 additional sites, the global megalithic frequency network becomes undeniable. 10 major sites, separated by continents and centuries, all exhibiting precise construction indicating advanced engineering knowledge, acoustic properties tuned to specific frequencies, mathematical relationships encoding harmonic principles, evidence of sonic construction methods, alignment to astronomical and cosmic cycles, proximity to water sources, and geological features that generate natural frequencies. They were nodes in a global network, positioned strategically, constructed according to unified principles, designed to generate, amplify, and broadcast frequencies across the planet. And as researchers continued examining other sites, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Machu Picchu in Peru, Avebury in England, the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, Nazca Lines in Peru, the same patterns emerged. Similar acoustic properties, similar mathematical relationships, similar evidence of sonic technology. The network wasn't limited to 10 sites. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds. Megalithic structures positioned globally, all apparently part of a coordinated system for generating and broadcasting frequencies. A system that had been dormant for thousands of years. A system that was being rediscovered. And a system that was now being deliberately suppressed. Which raises the ultimate question. If the megalithic frequency network could be reactivated, if the ancient knowledge of sonic technology could be fully recovered and applied, what would happen? What frequencies would broadcast globally? What effects would they have on human consciousness? And who would control the reactivation? These questions remain unanswered. Suppressed, hidden behind closed doors and non-disclosure agreements. But somewhere, in secure facilities, researchers and technicians are working to understand the megalithic technology fully, preparing for something. Something that will transform humanity, or control it, depending on who controls the activation. Everything we believed about the ancient world was incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. For centuries, we viewed ancient civilizations as primitive, limited in knowledge, dependent on brute force and simple tools. We built narratives of gradual technological advancement, slow progress toward modernity. But the stones tell a different story. A story of sophistication, of understanding, of knowledge so advanced that we're only now, in the modern world, beginning to comprehend it. The megalithic sites scattered across the planet aren't monuments to primitive achievement. They're archives of advanced knowledge, frequency devices encoding acoustic principles that shouldn't have been understood for thousands of years. Yet they were built, with precision that defies conventional explanation, with acoustic properties that suggest deliberate design, with mathematical relationships that correspond to harmonic principles and cosmic frequencies. The ancient world possessed sonic technology, technology that could move massive stones, that could shape matter using vibration, that could affect human consciousness through frequency. Technology that was carefully preserved and transmitted through mystery schools and initiatory traditions. And then it was lost, or hidden, deliberately suppressed, as if those who understood its power decided the world wasn't ready for it, wasn't wise enough to possess it, wasn't spiritually mature enough to wield it responsibly. The knowledge was encoded in the stones, hidden in plain sight, waiting for humanity to evolve, to develop sufficient wisdom, to become spiritually advanced enough to understand and use the technology responsibly. But something changed. In recent years, as researchers began measuring the frequencies at megalithic sites, as acoustic technology became more sophisticated, as the global pattern began emerging, the suppression intensified. The shutdowns began. The restrictions increased. The knowledge was forcibly silenced. Why? One possibility is fear. Fear that weaponization of frequency technology would occur. Fear that someone would understand the principles and use them for harm. Fear that a global frequency network, if activated by malicious actors, could control consciousness on a planetary scale. Another possibility is control, that those in power wanted to understand and monopolize the technology, to be the only ones with knowledge of how to reactivate the global frequency network, to control the activation and direct the frequencies for purposes only they determined. A third possibility is preparation, that the suppression is deliberate, coordinated, part of a plan to ensure that when the megalithic network is reactivated, everything is in place, all the pieces positioned, all the variables controlled, all outcomes predictable. The question becomes, which possibility is true? Are the authorities suppressing the knowledge out of fear, or are they preparing for activation? The answer may not be either or, it may be both. Authorities may fear the technology while simultaneously preparing to control and weaponize it. They may suppress public research while secretly conducting their own studies. They may prevent widespread understanding while quietly building the capability to activate the network when the time comes. Standing at a megalithic site, Stonehenge at dawn, the Great Pyramid at equinox, Baalbek in moonlight, you begin to sense something the ancient builders understood. These structures are alive, they're dormant, they're waiting. Not waiting passively, actively waiting. Their frequencies still resonating, still broadcasting at levels below human perception, still affecting consciousness even as we forgot why they were built. Researchers examining the subtle frequency effects at megalithic sites have documented measurable changes in visitor physiology, heart rate normalization, brainwave entrainment, immune function improvements. The sites are still working, still generating frequencies, still affecting consciousness, but at levels we don't consciously recognize. What would happen if the sites were deliberately activated, if frequencies were amplified, if the entire global network was synchronized and powered to full capacity? The effects would be undeniable. Frequencies broadcasting from coordinated locations globally, affecting every human consciousness simultaneously, inducing specific brainwave states across the entire population, creating a unified frequency field that could elevate or control consciousness depending on the frequencies selected and the intentions directing them. It would be power unprecedented in human history. Power to transform, power to heal, power to elevate consciousness across the entire species, or power to control, to manipulate, to create dependence on external frequency sources for consciousness and well-being. The potential for good is staggering. The potential for harm is equally staggering. And somewhere, hidden from public view, those with knowledge are making decisions about how and when this power will be deployed. The megalithic sites remain silent, waiting, resonating at frequencies below our perception. The knowledge is encoded in the stones, hidden, suppressed, but not lost, never lost. Because stones have memory, they hold the vibrations of everything that has occurred within and around them. The frequency technology used to build them, the ceremonies conducted at them, the consciousness transformations that occurred within them. All of it is encoded in the stone structure itself. And somewhere, someone is learning to read that memory, to understand the frequencies, to prepare for reactivation. The question of when isn't if, it's when. When will the megalithic network be reactivated? When will frequencies broadcast globally from coordinated locations? When will the transformation or control occur? And most importantly, Will humanity be ready? Will we possess the spiritual wisdom to use this technology for elevation of consciousness? Or will we allow it to be weaponized for control? The answer depends on what happens next, on whether the suppression continues or whether knowledge spreads, on whether humanity develops sufficient spiritual maturity to understand frequency technology before those in power activate it, on whether we collectively choose to demand transparency about the megalithic network and what authorities understand about its capabilities. Because the stones are waiting. The frequencies are broadcasting. And somewhere, in secure facilities, in hidden laboratories, in secret operations beyond public view, someone is preparing for activation. The only question remaining is, will we be ready when it comes? And more importantly, will we choose wisely about how to use this ancient technology that the megalithic stones have been broadcasting for thousands of years? The answer remains unwritten. But the stones remember everything, and they're about to teach us lessons we thought we'd forgotten forever.